Welcome to my presentation on payroll calculations. This is a case study of Fort Kent Industries. I am Michael Lambert Jr. This is for my Mathematics 1-4 class. Business Math. Today is September 15th, 2024. And lastly, the overview of the payroll scenario is of Fort Kent Industries, the weekly payroll study. The employees covered is going to be Chris, Lawrence, Greg, and Gunnar. Holiday is mandatory for Friday, and the key calculations we will be looking at are the regular earnings, the overtime, the holiday earnings, the commission, and the piecework wages. As for Chris's payroll calculation, we will have an annual salary of $89,760. His weekly hours is 36, 4 days for 9 hours each, and his overtime is 2 hours at time and a half. Holiday, he did not work on the mandatory holiday. As for Chris's payroll calculation, we have a weekly salary calculation, which is annual salary divided by 52 weeks, which will be 89,760 divided by 52, which equals $1,724.62. For the hourly rate calculation, we will be dividing weekly salary by weekly hours, which will be 1,724.62 over 36, which equals $47.90. And then for the overtime rate, it's hourly rate times 1.5. So the hourly rate, $47.90 times 1.5 equals $71.85. And for overtime earnings, overtime hours times overtime rate, 2 hours times 71.85 equals 143.70. And for Lawrence's payroll calculation, we have an hourly wage of $35.50, and his weekly hours is Sunday to Saturday, 8088838, which again is Sunday for 8 hours, Monday for 0, Tuesday for 8, Wednesday for 8, Thursday for 8, Friday for 3, and then Saturday for 8. Lawrence's payroll calculation, we will be adding up all the total regular hours together. 8 plus 0 plus 8 plus 8 plus 8 plus 3 plus 8 equals 43 hours. Regular earnings is going to be regular hours times the hourly wage. We have 40 hours times $35.50, which equals $1,420. Then for the overtime hours, we're going to be taking total hours minus 40, which is 43 minus 40 equals 3 hours. We're going to be taking that, and for the overtime rate, hourly wage times 1.5, we got to figure that out. So we're going to take 35.50 times 1.5, which equals $53.25 for the overtime rate. And then the overtime earnings, we're going to be doing overtime hours times overtime rate, which is 3 hours times 53.25, which equals $159.75. For Greg's payroll calculation, we have a sales amount of $123,000. For the commission rates, it's 2.25% on the first $100,000, and then it's 4.15% on the remaining amount. For Greg's payroll calculation, we're going to be doing commission on first $100,000, which is going to be $100,000 times 2.25%. 100,000 times 0.0225 equals $2,250. And then the commission on the remaining $23,000 is going to be $23,000 times 4.15%, or it's going to be $23,000 times 0.0415, which equals $954.5. The total commission earnings is commission on the first $100,000 plus the commission on the remaining amount, which is $2,250 plus $954.5, which equals $3,204.50. Now we will be looking at Gunnar's payroll calculation. His piecework wage is $2.24 per unit. Total hours worked is 30 hours, and his production rate is 1 unit every 5 minutes. As for Gunnar's payroll calculation, we're going to be looking at total units produced, total hours times 60 minutes, divided by production time per unit, which is 30 hours times 60 minutes, divided by 5 minutes, which equals 360 units. Piecework earnings, total units produced times piecework wage, 360 units times $2.24 equals $806.40. Now, as far as tax calculations, the state tax rate is 5.8%, Social Security tax rate is 6.2%, Medicare tax rate is 1.45%, federal tax rate is 22%. Now, as far as the tax calculations formulas, Chris's total earnings, which is regular plus overtime, 1,724.62 plus 143.70 equals $1,868.32. Now, for Lawrence's total earnings, regular plus overtime, is $1,420 plus $159.75, which equals $1,579.75. Now, Greg's earnings, he's on commission. His is $3,204.5. And then Gunner's earnings, the piecework, is $806.4. Now we're going to be looking at tax calculations, the deductions. The state tax is earnings times 5.8%, Social Security tax earnings times 6.2%, Medicare tax earnings times 1.45%, and then the federal tax is earnings times 22%. Now, let's start with Chris's deductions. For his state tax, the state tax total earnings times 5.8%, which is $1,868.32, times the 5.8%, which is $108.58. That's for his state tax. Now, for his Social Security tax, it's, again, the total earnings times 6.2%. So we're going to do 1868.32 times 6.2%, which equals $115.85. Now for the Medicare tax, we're going to be doing total earnings times 1.45%. So we're going to be taking 1868.32 times 1.4%, which is $27.11. And finally, for the federal tax, we're going to be taking total earnings times 22%, which is 1,868 times 0.32 times 22%, which equals $411.03 towards the federal tax. Now, as for Lawrence's deductions, we're going to be looking at his state tax. We're going to take his total earnings of $1,579.75 times the 5.8%. His state tax is $91.62. For his Social Security tax, we're going to take his earnings of $1,579.75 times it by 6.2%. We're going to get $97.94. As for his Medicare tax, we're going to be taking his total earnings, $1,579.75 times 1.45%, which is going to be $22.93. And finally, for his federal tax, we're going to be taking his total earnings of $1,579.75 times the 22%, which equals $347.55. Next, we're going to be looking at Greg's deductions. For his state tax, we're going to take his total earnings of $3,204.50 times it by 5.8. His state tax is $185.45. His Social Security tax total earnings times 6.2%, which is $198.87. For his Medicare tax, it's total earnings times 1.45%, which equals $46.46. And finally, for the federal tax, we're going to be taking the total earnings times 22%, which equals $704.99. Lastly, on the deductions, we're going to be looking at Gunner's. His total earnings is $806.40. For the state tax, we're going to multiply that by 5.8%. So for him, state tax, $46.83. Now for the Social Security tax, we're going to be taking the total earnings times 6.2%. For him, it's going to be $49.91. For his Medicare tax, we're going to be taking total earnings times 1.45%, which equals $11.71. And lastly, for the federal tax, we're going to be taking total earnings times 22%, which equals $177.41. To summarize all of our payroll calculations, again, all of the total earnings, we have Chris at $1,868.32, Lawrence at $1,420, Greg at $3,574.50. He's on commission. Gunner at $806.40. He's on piecework. And then the total regular earnings for all employees, if you add it all together, we got $7,669.22. Total overtime earnings, we got Chris. He's got 93.41. He worked 2 hours at time and a half. And then we got Lawrence. He worked 7 hours at time and a half, which is $159.75. Total overtime earnings for all employees, we have 253.16. We add together Chris and Lawrence's earnings. As for holiday earnings, no extra holiday earnings were calculated for this. And as far as holiday worked earnings, this is not applicable for this case study. And again, a summary of the payroll calculations. We have Chris with total regular earnings of $1868.32. His overtime earnings again is $93.41. Lawrence, we have a total regular earnings of $1,420. Overtime earnings $159.75. Greg, we have a total commission earnings of $3,574.50. And for Gunnar, we have total piecework earnings $806.40. As far as the importance of accurate payroll calculations, we need to worry about compliance. Accurate payroll ensures compliance with labor laws, tax regulations, and wage policies. Failure to comply to these can result in legal action. Also, accuracy. This ensures that employees are compensated correctly, reducing the risk of disputes, dissatisfaction, and turnover due to payroll errors. Efficiency. Streamlines payroll processing, reducing the time and resources spent on manual corrections or audits. Proper calculations contribute to seamless financial reporting. And lastly, consequences of errors. Payroll mistakes can lead to fines, penalties, and damage to company reputation. Incorrect calculations also undermine employee trust and confidence in the organization. And lastly, we have references. We got the American Payroll Association, the IRS, the Maine's Department of Labor, U.S. Social Security Administration, and the U.S. Centers for Medicare and Medicaid. Thank you for being a part of this presentation. And this concludes